Hi there, it's Ron Gula, and today we are going to interview my friend Mike Borella about all things in the legal world having to do with artificial intelligence. Mike, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Ron.
So Mike, we've known each other for a while. What's your background? Tell the audience a little bit about how you came to be an expert in all things AI legal.
Well, I came to it in a very circuitous path. I started off going to graduate school for computer science back in the 1990s. Finishing up there, I had a brief stint in academia, decided it wasn't really for me, moved over into industry. And in the 90s and early 2000s, I was working on wireless data gateways. So, today you've got 4G and 5G wireless. Back then it was 2G and 3G. And if you made a 2G or 3G call, as painfully slow as it was, you were going through our equipment most likely, because at one point we had about 80% of the market. That moved on to a startup after that, ran a pre-iPhone, pre-Android, a mobile app development company, and exited there. And that was about 16, 17 years ago. And I had a crossroads. I'm like, okay, I have a few things going on in my personal life. I got little kids, got some family members who need a little bit of extra help. I don't want to be on the road going to China, going to Europe, every couple of weeks like I was for a while. I want to stay here in Chicago. And along the way of being a software engineer and a software architect and a manager, I had gotten to know a number of IP attorneys. And about that time, the folks at my current firm, McDonald Bain and Holbert and Berghoff, or MBHB, got in touch with me and they said, "Hey, we heard that you're kind of in between things. Do you want to come work for us? We'll put you through law school at night, and you can be a patent attorney." So I thought about that for, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes, and I said, "Sure, sounds like a good deal." And I've been doing that ever since, and it's been a really fun, but circuitous career path.
So I've always had a lot of respect for people who get degrees in multiple career fields. But the reason we're talking today is because you've been doing a lot of intellectual property work in artificial intelligence. So what has the last couple years been for you now that everybody is an expert in artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so it has been a wild ride. The last 18 months have been some of the most transformative. So, what we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years is the rise of machine learning. So, machine learning went from this like little cottage industry that was it wasn't even called machine learning. There were just a bunch of statistical models, mostly very mathematical, very academic, and they were slowly being applied to practical uses. And we started writing patents on those back in like 2007, 2008. Then machine learning hit a few years later and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. But then there was a whole paradigm shift with generative AI, because machine learning, traditional machine learning and generative AI, they're similar in a lot of ways, but they're very different as well. And so for the last 18 months, there's been a plethora of issues with respect to patenting and now copyright related issues with generative AI.
And we're recording this now in January of 2024, but just a couple weeks ago, it was announced that the New York Times is suing OpenAI. Can you walk us through the lawsuit and what the implications could be?
Yeah, now this is admittedly a very long complaint, a very detailed set of allegations from the New York Times. So, without getting too much into the nitty legal technical weeds, what the New York Times is contending is that if you go to ChatGPT and you give it a specific series of prompts, it will actually recreate copyrighted, paywalled New York Times articles almost verbatim. And they give a few examples of this where they have several paragraphs of a New York Times article and then several paragraphs of that same article that's been generated by ChatGPT. And the difference is really just a few words. So this is a new thing. There's been other suits against OpenAI that are going on. Most famously, the Authors Guild, the actress Sarah Silverman, George R. R. Martin, the guy who wrote Game of Thrones. They've all sued OpenAI for copyright infringement, but they did not have this detailed level of allegation where ChatGPT not only ingests the copyrighted works, but also can reproduce them almost exactly the same way. So that makes the New York Times case different from all the previous cases that I've seen so far.
So what do you think the implications are for people who use OpenAI in their daily research and their maybe legal work? Maybe they've got an API going into a product. What are the implications and risks that they need to be worried about?
Well, these are the same sets of implications and risks that have been around since we first started looking into generative AI, and this is true whether it's a chatbot or whether it's like Midjourney or Dolly, a program that creates images, is that you just don't know what the model is doing to create the thing that it's showing you. And you don't know whether that creation could arguably be a derivative work of some copyrighted material that someone else owns. And so, if that's the case, your company is at risk of of violating that copyright. Now, there's a lot of ifs in there because, again, the way that these models work, nobody is quite sure exactly what goes into representing the works internally, or how those work, or how the work product that you ask it to generate through prompts is created. So you have to be aware that there's a possibility that that copyrighted material could get into your work product completely inadvertent.
And is there similar parallels with the use of open source libraries, open source software, if you're building software and doing derivative work with that?
There are some parallels here. Now, of course, with open source, there are some copyright poisoning licenses, like the GPL, for example, that certainly puts a lot of restrictions on what you can do downstream with respect to copyright or patenting the material that you use the open source tools or software to generate. Um, there are some open source large language models out there, and I think the implication here is almost more it's more financial for them, because a company like OpenAI, if they lose this lawsuit to the New York Times, every publisher is going to knock on OpenAI's door with their hand out asking for licensing revenue. OpenAI is, I don't know, what, an $80 billion company, and they're backed by Microsoft, which is a, I don't know, $2 or $3 trillion company. They have the revenue to at least negotiate licenses, but an open source LLM, they're not going to be a commercial endeavor. So if they end up even inadvertently violating copyrights, they're probably out of business because they're not going to be able to generate the revenue very easily to pay the licensing fees.
So when you're using an AI, chatbot, that sort of thing, or somebody else's model, one of the things that we talk about in cybersecurity a lot is the provability of that model. So from an intellectual property point of view, have you seen companies that have technology that can be used to sort of prove what's in the box, prove that there's no copyright data in there, that sort of thing?
No, I have not seen any tools like that yet. I still think that the predictability of these models, it's still somewhat open, up in the air. And I think even AI experts are having, they're still doing research on how to do that sort of thing. And with large language models like GPT-4, you're talking what, 1.5 trillion parameters, and nobody's quite sure exactly what they represent. So I think that we're a ways from that yet. I think the best thing that you can do right now is, if you get output from an LLM and you want to use it in your own commercial products, do some Google searching on, chunks, sentences that it produces, and see if there's something similar out there. At least do your diligence before you put it in your own product.
From an intellectual property point of view, if you're making a widget, you're making a software product, and you want to have your own AI model, you're going to start with the data. Now, is data something that you can protect from a legal point of view? Can you copyright that data? Is that something that's you can do derivative works with, that sort of thing? What's your advice there for startups?
Well, everything's data, right? So it's a book is data when it's digitized. This video is data. Everything is data. So that's copyrightable if it's an original creative work of human hands. So a book, a work of fiction, music, and so on, that's all copyrightable. It's all data. It can all be used to develop some sort of generative AI model. So the real question is, how do you select the data on which to train your model? You can get databases of books that are out of copyright. You can get certain articles for which you know that there's no copyright, and you can use that as training. What companies like OpenAI have contended is that if they can't use copyrighted works to train their models, they're going to go out of business. Now, that may or may not be true, but that's not a defense in copyright law. So that's an argument, but it's not a great legal argument for them.
I'm seeing a lot of changes in free copyright stuff. So, for example, I make a lot of 3D videos on this YouTube channel, And I'll download a free Blender model, and it'll be like, hey, it's free. You can use it. You can even use it for commercial purpose, but you can't use it to train an AI. So it's like a no AI training model. What are you seeing in that area of like free for humans, but not for computers, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's really interesting that this is still emerging, but this is something that we're seeing more and more of where someone is saying, well, look, here's a work that I'm going to put out there and I'm going to explicitly license it in such a way that you can use it for certain things, but you can't use it to train an AI model. This is a new development. It's really just been evolving over the last few months. The legality of that sort of license hasn't been challenged. I would presume it's probably going to be valid. But then enforceability becomes an issue because OpenAI seems to have admitted that they intentionally used copyrighted works to train their models. That, or at the very least, the New York Times is alleging that with some specificity in their complaint. So just because you have a license attached to your data that says don't use this for AI training, that doesn't necessarily mean people are going to pay attention to it.
So I have a theory, a view here that because OpenAI could be perceived as being tainted and hostile, right? It's going to consume your proprietary data, and it's going to get hooked up to everything like Office 365, your email, your spreadsheets, all that sort of stuff. Google's going to do something very similar. I have a feeling that people are going to start not trusting these cloud SaaS sources because their work that they're doing could be ending up training an AI. Have you seen any lawsuits in this area or people asking about, can I use Office 365 to do legal counsel of your clients, right? That's probably a good example for you.
Yeah, this is a big issue right now for law firms like mine because we use a lot of cloud-based tools to do our drafting, to do our document management, to do our sharing, and so on. And so if these documents, just by the fact that they're in the Microsoft cloud somewhere, could somehow be used to train the next generation of a Microsoft LLM, that's potentially problematic for my clients because certain documents need to be confidential. Some need to be confidential forever because they're trade secrets. Some need to be confidential until a certain point in time in which the information becomes public. So that is really a non-starter for businesses like ours. And I think Microsoft gets that. And the current model is that the Azure cloud, your instance within the Azure cloud is supposed to be secure and private. But I think with Microsoft, that's one thing. With smaller companies that maybe have less stringent security procedures, there certainly could be some leakage there, and I would worry about that.
It's funny because in cyber, we tell people if you're a small company, you probably don't have the resources to defend yourself. So get a partner, use SaaS services, that sort of thing. But then if you're like a big bank, you do have the ability to defend yourself from China and auditors from the government and that sort of thing. So it's gonna be interesting how this plays out. Speaking of government, there's been a lot of really interesting, output from the White House, from CISA, from NIST, from the SEC, all having to do with AI, use of data, ethics, bias, that sort of thing. What has been your take on this administration's role in keeping the AI terminators away from us?
Well, I thought that I read through the Biden executive order, all 130 some odd pages of it, and there's a lot of what I would call direction in there, and there are some requirements, but they're fairly high level. I think the most interesting thing or angle that the administration took was that they see a threat, a potential problem in any AI of a certain scale. So they give that scale in terms of computing power, in terms of flops, and so on. But and it has to be pretty huge. It has to be like at least the size of GPT-4, maybe even bigger than that before it gets triggered. But they're viewing it almost like a munition, where this is something that's potentially dangerous, and you need to tell the government, "Hey, I've trained this kind of model on this data center with these computing resources, and the model can do X, Y, and Z." And then you need to be able to establish that you've red teamed the model, you've tested it, you've got some guardrails on it so that people can't say, create the next, novel virus or bioweapon. So I thought that was really interesting. There was not a lot of detail, though, in the executive order itself. It was more a set of requirements and directives for the administrative agencies like NIST and so on to come up with regulations. Now, we're in 2024. We're what, 10 months away from an election. This is the Biden executive order. If Biden gets reelected, then you can probably expect that these procedures set forth in the executive order are going to continue for another 4 years or so. If Biden doesn't get reelected, we don't know what the next person's going to do. So they may just rescind the executive order, they may override it, they may leave it in place, but we're not going to know until November.
But unless I'm buying what, like thousands of those NVIDIA, GPU computers and working on some big models, I'm not in the same ballpark as the stuff that they're doing, right?
Right.
What when they had the executive order, I think they were talking about two different things, like a network of a certain size of computers connected together, and then the flops that you were talking about. What are some very, like, to me it really reminded me of like GPS when it first came out. Like, oh, the public can't have accurate GPS. My God, they could send a bomb and blow something up. Right now we use highly accurate GPS every day. I kind of wonder how much of that is something like that. We're just afraid of that, what could happen, and we're going to put some artificial barriers on it just to slow down. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's really interesting. As any dual use technology is, these generative AI models could be used for a lot of good, maybe drug discovery, automating those processes so the next great blockbuster drug gets discovered 10 years earlier, let's say. So that's a very good use. There's also potential bad uses, and we can imagine so many of them. They don't even have to be the Terminator scenario. It could just be that with a chat GPT based model, you can create an infinite amount of misinformation and spread it throughout social media at a very low cost. So I do think that there's a role for regulation, for government regulation here. I think the more interesting thing to look at with respect to regulation is actually what's happening in Europe, because Europe is always a little bit more pro-regulation than the US, and they're usually ahead of us on regulating new technologies. And the European Union has agreed upon a framework for regulating AI, and it's much more specific than anything we've seen in the US yet. And you know about the Brussels effect, right? So if something affects the European market, the providers, the product and service providers, are going to conform to that European standard throughout the world. So what we might end up seeing, unless OpenAI and companies like that want to do geofencing, is that whatever Europe is going to require out of these companies, that's going to be the de facto standard for the rest of the world, regardless of what the US government decides to do.
I think it's really interesting that we're here now because just a couple of years ago, we had Google basically saying they didn't want to use, their AI to work for the evil government, that sort of thing. And that seems to be behind us right now. I mean, it seems that there's a lot of people working on this, and there's a lot of commentary in the executive order where the intent is to do good, which I think is awesome. But replace the word AI with software. And I would say if we had that attitude towards the software industry, holy cow, we're completely off. So, what are your thoughts on, AI as software? Is this really just software that's doing different things for us, or is it something fundamentally different than a fancy program?
Well, at the end of the day, it is a fancy program, right? It's just a fancy program with a hell of a lot of data, a huge portion of a compressed representation of human knowledge driving it. So there are things that you can do with generative AI that so far you can't do with any other software that I'm aware of. And the question, I guess, comes down to, are those things problematic enough to warrant this extra level of scrutiny? And historically, the U.S. government has had a very hands-off approach on tech. I mean, we still are very reluctant to regulate social media in any way, even though we know that it's potentially harmful to certain individuals. So, yeah, this is going to be interesting. Given the approach that the U.S. government has had over the last 30 years, this would be a change if we started heavily regulate AI. And also, we just don't know at this point what scenario is going to be in the future. Does generative AI just kind of become the next tool that we all use, and it gets integrated into life, and all of these horror story scenarios just don't come to pass? That's possible. I mean, human beings, we've had nuclear weapons for what, 80 years now, and we haven't blown ourselves all up yet. So we have the ability, but we've, as a society, decided not to use it. Can we do that with with large language models and generative AI as well? Or are they going to be rogue actors or rogue states that take this in a horrible direction? We just don't know at this point. I think it's appropriate for governments of the world to scrutinize what's going on, but to be very careful about how they regulate it, because you don't want to regulate small companies or open source, uh, you know, projects out of existence with too much of a heavy hand.
So, question for startup people who are using AI. There's a lot of companies where they've produced blogs, they produce white papers. Like I have all my YouTube videos here, and I'm very tempted to take all that content and create a chatbot, based on that training right there. So, what are some of the intellectual property and copyright issues for founders and creators out there if they kind of take all this work that they've done, which might be public, might be available anyway, and they create a chatbot? What should they be thinking about?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting aspect. So the thing is that copyright law does not protect a style or a way of a particular artist's way of producing the material. It just predicts or protects the works of expression themselves. So, from a copyright point of view, there's nothing wrong with certainly doing that, and the works that that chatbot outputs, if it's in the style of Ron Gula, but it's not a derivative work of anything Ron Gula said, that might be independently copyrightable and might not be a copyright violation of anything that you do. But the really interesting thing that if you're creating a chatbot like that, how are you going to license it? So you can come up with licensing terms so that any user has to adhere to your license. So that the license might be, and we've seen this with like Stability AI. You could say, okay, if you want to use the free version of the software, we own the copyright of any of the output. You don't get to own the copyright. If you pay us $20 a month, you get to own the copyright. So those are the sort of business models that we're starting to see people wrap around these chatbots.
So that brings me to the second question for founders. So people who have AI in their tool stack, whether to create art, to create content, to do research, what are some of the differences between like Midjourney and OpenAI, Claude AI? Are there large differences in maybe like Adobe Firefly, right, where they very very prominently say all of this stuff is our own. We don't have any copyright issues. Like, what are some of those things that you're seeing with some of the brands in AI that are out there?
Yeah, it really comes down to the licensing agreement. So this is where you need someone to read through the terms and decide based on the license that you've actually gotten. And several of these models have different licenses that you pick depending on how much you pay or what options you choose. You have to figure out who owns what under what conditions. And so we started looking into this about 18 months ago when some of our clients wanted to use Midjourney and Dolly to generate artwork for their software, and we started going through licensing terms and trying to and it's evolved a lot since then. I mean, back then it was a lot more restrictive. It was less pro user, and now there are much more pro user types of licensing terms where you can, if you pay them enough and you get the right agreement, you own all the output, and they're not going to have any claim over it.
So another startup question, if you're in the business of curating data, it could be healthcare data, drone footage, GPS data, who knows, right? But you want to eventually sell this data to an AI company, whether they're going to make a private model, public model, whatever. From a cybersecurity model, I can advise people all day on how they should protect that data, encrypt it, shard it, do all that kind of stuff. But what should they be doing from a legal point of view when it comes to chain of custody, how they made the data, who had access to it, things like that? What advice can you have for people who are focused on the data side of training an AI?
Yeah, this is kind of a novel question now because with these massive amounts of data, if you just hand it over to an AI company and say, well, use it to train a model, they've got to store it somewhere. You've got to make sure that they've got the right cybersecurity protections in place on that data. And also, how long are they going to keep it? Are they going to retrain the model every few months? And in which case, they're going to keep the data maybe forever? Or is this just like one and done? They keep it for a little while, then they erase all copies of it. Or do you just give them access to your database through a secure channel and let them pull data from your master copy of it whenever they need to? This is still kind of up in the air, and we haven't seen a trend in the industry as to how to solve this problem.
But they should be doing more than just cybersecurity, right? They should have some sort of documentation, probably API models to document how the data is used, maybe immutable data storage, all those kind of things I think should be on the table for people. All right. So the last question I'm going to ask is, what is the biggest misconception you're seeing when your clients call you up and they've got some sort of problem, right? They've either had some intellectual property stolen, they want to sue somebody, that sort of thing. What's the biggest misconception that they have when they walk through your doors and start seeking your legal counsel in the world of AI?
Biggest misconception. Yeah, there's a lot of little
Oh,
misconceptions
what
with
are some of them then? Yeah.
time. Um, a l- well, let me address this from a fairly specific point of view that this is something that comes up all the time. A lot of the work that we do at my firm is patent acquisition, so drafting new patent applications. And a lot of companies come to us and they'll say, well, we took an off the shelf neural network and we applied it to some data that we found, and we want to get a patent on that. And my answer is like, sure, we could help you with a patent application, but the likelihood of that being patentable is pretty low because you're using a generic model on generic data. And so where's the innovation there, right? Unless there was something special about figuring out that that model works really well with that data, there's really no invention. So that's one big misconception that we deal with. The other misconception I think is that a lot of copyright holders, they just look at something that comes out of an LLM that seems similar to something they may have a copyright on, and they want to go out and file a lawsuit. And that's, that in and of itself is arguably not a copyright violation, because a derivative work has to have a lot of the same character and nature of the original work. And if you're just telling ChatGPT to, like, write a new chapter of, write fan fiction for me, that's real hit or miss as to whether it's a derivative work or not. So it's a fairly nitty legal analysis to figure out whether there's a case there. And a lot of copyright holders just, they think they have a case and they really don't.
All right, Michael. Thank you so much for spending some time with me answering my questions. What about a plug for your law firm? How do people get in touch with you? What type of clients should be calling you? That kind of, let's close out with that.
Thanks for that opportunity. So we are McDonald, Danon, Holbert, and Berghoff. We're in Chicago, right across the street from the Sears Tower. And you can go to our website, mbhb.com, M as in Michael, B as in boy, H as in Harry, B as in boy.com. And we do copyright, patent, licensing, and trademark work. And we're a mid-sized law firm of about 70 practitioners. And we work with companies everywhere from Fortune 100 down to individual startups, people working in their basements and garages and so on new tech. And we've been doing it for about 25 years.
Awesome. And I'll add your LinkedIn profile here as well. Thanks again for joining us. For everybody who's watching this, please give us a like and subscribe to the channel. If you want to see more interviews like this, more videos, drop me a note on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you once again, Michael.